And because we're just about on time, we're right about 9:15, we're going to start with the first talk. So I'm going to have Steve come up, and we will start off the day with Connecticut Warblers, everybody. So Steve, if you don't know Steve, he's an avian ecologist with NRRI in Duluth, who's been working on nighthawks for a few years, boreal chickadees, and Connecticut Warbler, black terns, and things. And I loved this note you added, Steve, that when he's not working, Steve spends a large amount of time loitering at strategic geographic locations near large bodies of water, looking for bird migration. So you can ask him about that later, I think, but we'll pass it to Steve.
Good morning, everyone. I guess my boss is here, so I shouldn't say it, but occasionally while I am working, I do that too. So, yeah. Great to see everybody this morning. Happy to talk to you all about some Connecticut Warblers on this frigid morning. So let's dive right in. Okay, so I know the audience here. I know that most of us are very familiar with Connecticut Warblers, but just in case, Connecticut Warblers are a relatively large warbler, but still a small bird. And they, most of us encounter them by going out into a black spruce or tamarack bog in the summertime, and you listen for this bird, and all of a sudden, just out of nowhere, you hear this whoop-a-da-whoop-a-da-whoop-a-da-whoop-a-da-whoop, and you're like, all right, I think that might have been it. And then you wait 9 seconds, which feels like about an hour and a half because there's thousands of black flies and mosquitoes and stuff like that buzzing around your head, and then you hear whoop-a-da-whoop-a-da-whoop, and then you're like, okay, I think that's it. And it's up there, and it's sitting on the top of a tamarack or black spruce. And hopefully, eventually, you can see one just lurking around like this nice picture from Alex here. Thanks, Alex. But of course, the rest of the year, or if you are looking for female Connecticut Warblers, they're not nearly as confiding or inviting as the males. And so this picture on the right, that's sort of more typically what you look for on migration. And so that's your more classic view of a Connecticut Warbler, right? I'm sure many of you can agree with that. And then I guess if you have really bad luck, you can get a little bit overzealous and like, whoa, look at that white eye ring on that. Oh, it's a Nashville Warbler. And then everybody gets excited for a second. And then you're like, oh, it's cool. It's a Nashville Warbler. So now that we're all on the same page, like I mentioned, Connecticut Warblers, they breed in Minnesota exclusively in black spruce and tamarack forests, but not just any kind of those forests. They're sort of like a bit of a Goldilocks species. They don't like super dense stands of these trees. They don't like really, really open stands either, so they like the happy medium in the middle. So both of these pictures, tamarack on the left, black spruce on the right, sort of have that structure where scattered, somewhat dense but not very dense trees, open overstory, and as you can see in the picture, lots of herbaceous material on the understory. That's where you're going to find Connecticut Warblers. Okay, so where in the state do you do it? Like I mentioned, it's in northern Minnesota. And you can see that most of their population, about 97% of all Connecticut Warblers, breed in Canada. And at this point, we basically have the other 3%. They used to breed in Michigan and Wisconsin in some numbers. They're essentially extirpated in those areas presently. But we still have a lot of them in northern Minnesota, especially in that area that's highlighted on the right there, the Agassiz Lowland subsection of the state. It's a very large lowland bog area that is dominated by black spruce and tamarack habitats that they like. If you want to see Connecticut Warblers in the state, that's where to go. And another thing that we know about Connecticut Warblers is their populations are declining. So not to start off with a major down note, but this is the case with Connecticut Warblers, is that they are declining. On the left, you can see our lab at NRRI has a 28-year-long program at this point where we go out and survey the same points in the National Forest, Chippewa, and Superior every year. And you can see that, well, we're not seeing as many Connecticut Warblers as we used to. So that's troubling and not what we want to see, and hopefully not what any of you want to see as well. And then, also another way that, the foundation of a lot of our bird knowledge is the breeding bird surveys that happen throughout North America. And this is the U.S. Trend for Connecticut Warbler as well. So they are declining in the U.S., and that's not great. And we really don't know much about them, and as a result, we don't have a tremendous idea of why they're declining. What we do know about them, some work that has happened in our lab and elsewhere across their range, is all gleaned from those really loud broadcasting males that you can hear and learn about and go and see on their breeding habitat. They're relatively, easy to study in that way because they are loud and vocal and stuff like that and obvious. But after that, they're extremely secretive. It's very, very difficult to find their nests. It's very difficult to even see a female bird on the breeding ground. And so we know virtually nothing about what they do during the breeding season outside of what males do, singing from the tops of tamarack or black spruce trees. And so what we wanted to do is really start to drill down to, so does what we understand about breeding male Connecticut warblers, does that translate to what females need, what they need for nesting, what the nest habitat is, and then also what the nestlings and fledglings need once they leave their nest. And so we set out to do that, myself and a few others who are here, including Kara, our fearless leader for the paper session today. She was a field tech on all of these seasons, and in fact is responsible for finding more nests than I am, but I'm going to take all the credit, Kara, if that's cool. All right, yeah. So in 2019, we worked in the Saxon Bog. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that area. And in 2020, we worked up, we were based at a Norris camp in the Red Lake WMA. Thank you, Charlie, for all of that. On the right here, you can see figure A. All the white dots, if you can make them out, are singing males, and all of the yellow stars are nests that we found. And so if you read the quote on the last slide, a lot of what we know is based on one nest. Well, we found 11 nests in a couple years, and so that might not sound like a lot, N of 11, whatever. It was a tremendous amount of work, and it's amazing that we found that many, I think. And so we learned an awful lot about the nesting of Connecticut warblers in this area. And one of the reasons why it's really hard, here's some eye candy for you. This is a Connecticut warbler nest. They nest on the ground in sphagnum moss tussocks that are covered often with grass or Labrador tea or leather leaf or a combination of those things, and they're essentially invisible unless you happen to get extremely lucky and almost step on one or are patient enough to deal with the hordes of flying insects to watch a female bird that is pretending to be a mouse scurrying through the undergrowth and sneakily trying to feed young or something along those lines. But when you sort of peer in there, they do have a nice nest that is lined with grass and stuff like that, and they do have eggs like all birds, and then they hatch and they are looking like little alien things, and then they get a little bit bigger and they get some feathers, and that's really cute. And then part of this study was we really wanted to know, like I said, what do they do after they leave the nest and what habitats they use and so on and so forth. And so when they were about a week out of the egg, they look like what they do on the left there. So they look like sort of like feathered cockroach type things. And we would put some bands on them, and then we put a little transmitter you can see on its back there. It weighs like a couple grains of rice. And then we would follow them around, and look at this cute little guy. He's like 2 or 2.5 weeks out of the nest at that point. He's got some really fluffy feathers and stuff like that. But we'd follow them around, and then we would take really detailed notes about where they were, and then we would come back and do extremely detailed vegetation surveys and so on and so forth for where these birds were moving to and what habitats they were using during that period of their life. And why do we care about that period in their life? Well, that's one time of a bird's life when it is really likely to die. And as a result, well, of course, we don't like birds dying, right? We want more birds, not less birds. How do you get more birds? Well, you got to keep birds from dying, and you also got to get more birds into the population, right? So you need more things happening on the breeding grounds that are going to increase the number of birds that get into your population. And we also need to figure out what habitats those birds are using, where they're going, why they're dying, why they're living during that really important time in their life. On the right here, you can see a figure that this is weekly survival rates. So first week out of the nest, your survival rate is somewhere around 85%. That's not great. I don't like those odds particularly, but it gets better as a bird ages, right? So that is a really vulnerable time for birds, and that's why we wanted to study it and see, what they're doing, where they're going, how they're living, and why they're dying. And so after a tremendous amount of work and heartache and so on and so forth, we can finally get some results that look like this, and this is just distance from a bird's nest. And so we track these birds every day and see where they go, mark a GPS point, so on and so forth, go back every day until we lose the birds. And you can see that in general, as you'd expect, they sort of start traveling farther from the nest as they get older. One thing to note here is that the scale is probably pretty hard to read, but it's up to 250 meters. And so about 200 meters is about as far away from the nest as what we documented these birds moving, even as much as 3 weeks out. Without much context, I'm not sure that means a whole lot, but I'll give you some context here. Most birds travel a lot farther than that during that period of time. Sometimes they will go kilometers or, multiple kilometers or even tens or dozens of kilometers away during that period of time. These birds don't. They leave the nest really early, and it's almost like, you have all of your eggs or baby birds in one nest, and then they all sort of scatter and then just sort of hunker down as almost these little satellite nests for a while they're in the sort of feathered cockroach phase. And then eventually they start wandering around a little bit, but they don't go that far. So that was a really interesting finding, kind of relief in a lot of ways, what I'll get to in a second. But, so this is a blow-up of the area that we studied in the Red Lake WMA in 2020. Like I said, all the white dots are singing males, all the yellow stars are nests. This is a 200-meter radius that's been drawn around all of the nests. So essentially, this is the area that we saw birds could theoretically go or could use from that nest. And one thing that I thought was important to take away from this, and hopefully you do too, is that there's an awful lot of overlap here. These birds, when they find the correct habitat, that Goldilocks habitat, they really do pack in there pretty good, and then they don't really move around that much during that vulnerable period of time. So, if we can connect some dots, it is, I think, fortunate that because we know very little about Connecticut warblers other than what the breeding males do, that the young birds, and as a result the females in the nests, sort of do use the same habitat and do use the same things as the singing males do. So in a sense we may be, and of course this is all preliminary, but we may be able to use singing males as a proxy for habitat that is used by females to build nests, but also, more importantly, for young birds that have left the nest that are in that really vulnerable period of time in their lives when so many of them die. So that's good news, because that's what we know the most about. Not that we know a lot, but we know more about that than we do about any other part of their life. Okay, so that's some good news, but it doesn't explain or get around the fact that Connecticut warblers are still declining, right? And so how do we stop that, or how do we deal with that? Well, the little bit of research that's out there on Connecticut warblers suggests that despite the fact that Connecticut warblers migrate long distances, cool fun fact, most of them migrate to the mid-Atlantic region of the United States, launch themselves off of the coast, and fly nonstop across the ocean till they get to the Greater Antilles or so on and so forth. Probably a thing that takes a couple days. So that's pretty amazing for a bird that lurks around in black spruce and tamarack swamps in northern Minnesota for the summer. It goes to, New Jersey or Maryland or wherever, and then launches off and flies to South America. That's pretty cool. But despite the fact that they do that and they winter in South America and all that, the most recent and current research suggests that the problem is on our end, is on the breeding grounds. And so we need to take that in consideration. I think we need to take on that responsibility. Certainly, like I said, even if there are other issues, and there are, throughout their life cycle, the only time when we're getting more Connecticut warblers into the world is on the breeding grounds here, right? So, like I said, they require a specific type of black spruce and tamarack habitat, and I think, the odds are greater of finding that habitat on the landscape if you have a lot of black spruce and tamarack, right? There's lots of black spruce, lots of black and tamarack that is no good for these birds, but if you have a huge chunk of it, some part of that is going to have the magic mix of requirements that they need. And so, that's one thing that we, advocate for. We are, as a group, as a lab, we're trying to do, a lot of work on behalf of Connecticut Warblers. We are worried about them, and we are discouraged that their populations are declining, and we want to do everything we can to help them. So one of the things we're doing, in addition to this study that I've been describing today, is we are part of a Connecticut Warbler working group that just formalized. We just had our first meeting last month or this month. It was really fun and met with lots of people from mostly Canada, but representatives from every state or province where these birds breed, and learned an awful lot about Connecticut Warblers throughout the range. They do some interesting stuff. For example, they breed in jack pine forests in Wisconsin and in Quebec and other areas in the eastern part of the range. They breed in aspen forests in the western part of the range. That's pretty crazy and pretty weird. They do still have that sort of Goldilocks structure to the habitat in all those places. That's really interesting too. And we learned that there are more people out there that do care about Connecticut Warblers and know about them than we previously knew. So that's exciting, and hopefully that will lead to more collaboration and more good work as we think about that species holistically, and not just in Minnesota. And then we do provide recommendations and push for change in the way that black spruce in particular is harvested in the state. Like I mentioned, considering the landscape, fragmentation is never, very rarely a good thing for birds, especially birds like Connecticut Warblers. Retaining some trees, typically the old school way of doing things with black spruce is to clear cut it all, and that doesn't do a whole lot for Connecticut Warblers at all. And so keeping anything would be good, extending the period of time in which they're on the ground, so on and so forth. And in recent years, we've started working with partners in the DNR in particular, working on implementing some experimental harvests throughout the state. This is up in the Red Lake WMA. And what you see here is this is a stand of black spruce that is currently too dense to be used by Connecticut Warblers. But we're hoping that if we can sort of find a happy medium where we do allow some harvest in this stand, but also it's not all gone, we can maintain black spruce breeding species and even attract Connecticut Warblers with group selection on the left or different kinds of strip cutting on the right there. And so we have a couple of those that have been sold to loggers in recent years, and we're hoping that maybe this winter even some of them will get cut, and we have lots of pre-data and we'll get post-data, and it's going to be a very interesting study, and certainly would have lots of implications and recommendations that we could provide to land managers. Okay, so that's what we're doing as a group for Connecticut Warblers. How about you? What can you do to help Connecticut Warblers? And I'm not going to lecture anybody here, but I'll just say that, I do like lecturing people a little bit. So, climate change is potentially existential threat to Connecticut Warblers. I don't think that's a game-changing thought. But, obviously we need large-scale changes to happen with that nationally and globally. But also just think about, things that we can do, too, including our own carbon footprint, especially as birders. We probably have a above-average carbon footprint, but because of all the things we do, because we love birds and we love traveling and seeing birds places and so on and so forth. So think about those sorts of things. Connecticut Warblers also are susceptible to collisions. In fact, they've been termed like a super collider in that they sort of punch above their weight in terms of how many are found at buildings or turbines potentially or towers that they can smack into at night, especially when they're migrating. And so we should advocate for lights out programs and so on and so forth. But also think about every one of us here, likely lives somewhere with windows. And even if those windows kill a bird or two a year, that's a lot of birds if we add all of us up. And then if we add, and we think about that in terms of the city and the state and so on and so forth, that may be a bigger threat overall than, say, a single building or something like that. Even though that building seems like it's killing an awful lot of birds, collectively, all of our windows and buildings are killing a lot too. So something to consider, making those a little safer for birds with bird safe glass or stickers or whatever. And then lastly, like a lot of public land, especially there's lots of black spruce and tamarack, Connecticut warbler habitat on public land, and when these are being put up for harvest, there are public comment periods. You can Google that, stand exam list, public comments. Go on there, make your voice heard. Say, hey, I don't think that this large tract of black spruce should be harvested, or have you considered, not clear cutting this and doing something different for these species that are imperiled and that, we know that there are issues with their populations in the state and elsewhere. So some things to think about along those lines. And I think that's about time. So thank you for your attention. Hopefully I was a good leadoff hitter and we can just slide right into the rest of the talks. But I'm happy to take questions for a few minutes. And if you don't have a chance, please come find me. I'll be awkwardly laughing and stuff like that around for the rest of the day. So come find me and talk. Otherwise, shoot me an email. Thank you.
So as far as questions go, Catherine's going to run around with the mic. So if you do have any questions, hands up. We've got a couple questions over here, so we'll start with Bill.
Just wondering from early in your presentation where looked like there was a kind of a peak in population in the 80s, and then it started declining. Any sense why it was increasing? Is it just from reporting or discoveries, or is there some other explanation?
Yeah, that's a little bit puzzling. Yeah, but I think that in general, land cover during that period of time did increase in quality, and like forests got older, trees got older, and so on and so forth after the large harvest before that. And so I think it probably was an actual increase, and we see this in a number of bird species, and an actual increase in populations for a while, and then we started seeing effects of lots of things that we talk about now, habitat loss, but also climate change and, stopover habitat issues, wintering habitat issues, all that stuff, yeah. But good question.
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me? Okay. To what extent are the invasive earthworms getting rid of forest flora? And
yeah, so
how is that affecting the nesting?
Yeah, well, in the systems in which Connecticut warblers breed, I don't believe earthworms are an issue at all. It's all sphagnum moss, and I don't think there are many earthworms. Maybe if someone knows more than I do about that, but I don't believe that's an issue where they are in the breeding grounds. However, it is definitely an issue during their stopover habitat, at least. They they are not, coniferous specialists during stopover. They'll use deciduous forests, and they'll often be found in very, sort of what we would call disturbed areas and stuff like that. So certainly, stopover habitat for Connecticut warblers is being degraded by earthworms. Yeah.
Steve, a comment about the habitat. You said the jack pine use was kind of an eastern thing, and that when they're in aspens, it's more of a western.
Yeah, in general. And then there's a lot of jack pine breeding in Wisconsin and Michigan as well.
Yeah, have those died out at all, those populations? Because the reason I ask is because when I used to do tours up in Manitoba, we'd find them all the time in these really tall, mature aspen forests.
Yeah.
And then when I stopped doing tours, they kind of disappeared out of there. And jack pines used to, Frank here and others that have done work in Douglas County, Wisconsin, can tell you they pretty much disappeared from there in the jack pines, which was maybe just loss of habitat. But I know in Michigan, I wonder if they're still going strong. But that was interesting about the habitat choice.
Yeah, it is really interesting that they can shift so, in our mind, dramatically, like we think about cover type, jack pine to aspen to black spruce to tamarack. That's like a crazy mix, but yeah, it really is like, it seems like that structure piece, and then all those forests always have that really dense herbaceous layer. But yeah, I think like Michigan, Wisconsin, they're like doing horribly. I think they're doing okay in eastern Quebec, maybe declining a little bit, but certainly they're doing okay, at least in the aspen in the west. One more?
Is this on? I was wondering if the decline in the 80s was at the same time that the spruce budworm outbreak was hitting?
Well, let's see. Yeah, so certainly that is about the same time of the large spruce budworm outbreak in the east, especially. I don't think they're super related. A lot of the, well, for one thing, a lot of the budworm really likes fir, right, rather than spruce, even though it does like spruce, but it's really going after balsam fir. And so it's mostly in upland areas, I guess, and in those areas. And so I don't think, and certainly Connecticut Warbler is not a species that is known to respond one way or the other to spruce budworm, unlike Cape May Warbler, Tennessee, bay-breasted, that sort of thing. But I think they're relatively, resilient to that because they're sort of in those lowland bogs, and they also are a little bit plastic and using tamarack and black spruce and stuff like that, yeah. All right.
Okay, thanks everybody. If you have more questions, like Steve said, he'll be around. His email's up on the screen. Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, thank you.